Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Rebooted MCU. Today we are here with Phase 3 Part 6. We have a lot to get through today, so let's go ahead and jump right in with the 12th project of Rebooted MCU, Phase 3. The 12th project of Rebooted MCU, Phase 3 is Avengers Endgame. The movie opens up with Clint Barton, played by Jeremy Renner, sitting down on his couch. So we see that on his hand he has a wedding ring. "I know this is lame for a honeymoon," he says, "but hey, my California ranch is good, right?" We hear a woman say, "Clint, it's beautiful," as we see Barbara Barton, played by Linda Cardinelli, walk into the room and sit next to him. "I love you," says Clint, as the two kiss. Clint gets up to grab a bottle of wine for the two of them. As he leaves the room, he asks her if she likes white or red, but he never hears a response. When he returns, we see that his wife has been dusted. We cut to Tony Stark, played by Robert Downey Jr., Johnny Storm, played by Andrew Garfield, and Nebula, played by Karen Gillan, all on the Ravager ship that Nebula used to crash into Thanos. The Q ship was destroyed when Thanos threw the moon at the team when they fought during Infinity War. Tony leaves a message to Pepper Potts about how he loves her and that the three are unlikely to survive as they are running out of food and other resources. As Tony closes his eyes, a shining light appears in front of him, which turns out to be Captain Marvel, played by Natalie Dormer. Back on Earth, Steve Rogers, played by Chris Evans, Natasha Romanoff, played by Scarlett Johansson, Bruce Banner, played by Mark Ruffalo, and Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, are waiting as Captain Marvel lands the ship. Tony exits and we see that he is visually skinnier than he was before. As he exits, he confronts Steve about how angry he is about how everything ended, and he passes out as Pepper rushes to bring him and Johnny to the hospital. Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, is seen pouting as Banner notes that his Infinity Detector picked up that Thanos has used the Infinity Stones about an hour ago. Captain Marvel suggests that the team go confront Thanos, and Nebula offers to pilot the ship as long as they can get it refueled, and Steve Rogers okays the plan. We then watch as Captain America, Black Widow, Thor, Hulk, Nebula, and Captain Marvel go to confront Thanos. The scene plays out exactly the same way it does in the actual Endgame, thus finding out that Thanos atomized the stones, and Thor proceeds to cut off his head. We then have a 3-year time jump, not a 5-year, as we cut to New York, where an abandoned building sits. We see the microversal entry point when suddenly a rat steps on the lever, activating it. It proceeds to spit out Hank Pym, played by John Krasinski, and Janet Van Dyne, played by Emily Blunt. Hank immediately rushes to turn out the microversal entry point as Janet comments, "Henry, how long were we down there?" We watch as Hank and Janet walk around New York and discover how much of the city has changed. We see a ripped piece of paper that reads, "Mayor F. reminds you, curfew at 8 p.m. Hank and Janet stumble upon a monument called the Snap Memorial, where we see a list of people who turned to dust. On the stone, we see Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne. Hank and Janet look at each other as Hank says, "We need to go check on the others." We cut to the Avengers mansion where we see Black Widow speaking in a virtual conference call with Captain Marvel, who's been monitoring the deep space, Nebula and Johnny, who've been monitoring the inner galaxy, and Okoye, played by Denai Guerrera, who's been monitoring Wakanda. The group catches up, and as Natasha ends the call, we see Steve Rogers walk in with a bag of food, and the two catch up. Steve tells Natasha that he's been going to therapy, and it has been really helpful. Natasha says that she could bring herself to leave. Steve asks if she has heard anything else about Clint, and Natasha says that she has, but it's not been anything good. Suddenly, a notification pops up on the mansion's security system as we see that Hank and Janet are standing outside the mansion. As Steve and Natasha go to let them in, both break down into tears as they hug Hank and Janet. Natasha manages to get out that she thought both of them had died. Steve explains what happened with Thanos, including the stones being atomized and the 3 years that have passed. Janet explains that she and Hank were trapped in the microverse, and that while 3 years pass out here, it only felt like 3 hours for them. Hank jumps in and says, "We also found time vortexes, pathways to the past, that maybe, if we could figure out how they operate, might give us a way to fix this mess." but I'm going to need to talk with my old science pal before we get too ahead of ourselves. We cut to Steve, Hank, Janet, and Natasha driving to meet Tony Stark, who's been married to Pepper Potts since the snap, but they do not have a kid. Hank explains the situation to Tony, who scoffs at the idea and says, "Look, Hank, Janet, I'm thrilled that you two are here and survived, but don't give me hope. It's an impossible task to time travel, plus we have no idea how doing something like that could impact our present." Tony turns the team down as he walks inside to go see Pepper. The four of them then meet with Bruce Banner. Bruce is in his Professor Hulk form, which we will explore more of in future projects. Hulk explains that he achieved this form by working with Dr. Helen Cho, a geneticist, who helped him when Stock, Samson, and Jen were dusted. Hank explains the microverse to Hulk, who agrees that it is possible to time travel, and also agrees to help the group work on figuring out the intricacies. We cut back to the Stark residence that night as Tony and Pepper are lying in bed and are talking about how Hank visited them earlier in the day. Pepper says to Tony, "You know, honey, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we had a kid of our own. You know, a little Tony?" Tony sighs. "Pepper, you know I feel that I already lost one kid. I don't know if I could go through watching another one grow up again, see them mature, just for it to potentially get snatched away from me. And then I can die knowing that I didn't have enough time with them. I can't do it again." Tony sits up, and as he does, it's revealed that on his nightstand, he has a picture of himself and Peter Parker. Tony looks at the picture and tells Pepper that he's going to burn the midnight oil, and he heads downstairs. We see that Tony begins playing with some of the concepts that Hank discussed with him earlier about time travel and attempts to figure out if there's a way that he could create a GPS-like device that could allow them to travel from one point to another while figuring out a way to return back to the present without impacting anything in a different timeline. As he works on this for the remainder of the night, he finally figures it out. He freaks out and calls Pepper, who walks down yawning, and he explains to her what he discovered. Pepper smiles as Tony looks at her and says, "Pepper, am I doing the right thing?" Pepper laughs. "Tony, my love, I think you know more than anyone what the right thing is regarding this situation." Tony stops and looks at his discovery as we slowly fade back to the Avengers HQ the following morning. We watch as Bruce, Hank, Janet, Steve, and Natasha have been running the time travel experiment on a large ant using the Pym backpack, but the results have not been great so far. Tony arrives as Steve meets him out front as he explains that he stayed up all night and he thinks he figured something out and that they should assemble the rest of the team. And as he does this, he goes to the back of his car and takes out the old shield and returns it to Captain America. Hulk travels to New Asgard in Scotland, where we see Valkyrie, played by Tessa Thompson, who explains that Thor has not been himself lately, and he lives near the outskirts of town in the woods. Hulk travels to the outskirts of town, where we see a small hut. Inside we find Korg, voiced by Josh Gad, who explains that Thor has not stopped training since the snap, and that he has not forgiven himself about what happened with Thanos. Hulk and Korg walk to a cliff facing the sea, where we see Thor meditating, and Hulk says, "Thor, pal, are you okay?" Thor turns around and says, "Go away, Banner. I wish to be alone." Hulk explains the situation. Thor explains that the only thing he's done since the snap has been getting a new eye to replace the one cut out by Hela, and has kept training since, but he still feels unworthy because he let the entire world down. Hulk stops and says, "Look, Thor, I know how you feel. I used to think I was a monster. Someone nobody would love. Somebody who always made the lives of those around me worse. But trust me, Thor, that's not true for me, and it's not true for you. We can't change what has happened, but right now, we have a chance to rewrite our story. We have a chance to prove to yourself that you are worthy. We need you, Thor." We see Thor stand up, call Stormbreaker, and walks up to Hulk saying, "Banner, take me to the others." Steve heads to Hong Kong, where we find Clint Barton, who has taken on the Ronin persona. Steve confronts him, and Clint explains that after he lost his wife, he lost something in himself. Steve tears up. "Buddy, If I knew what was going on, I would have been there. Clint tears up. It's not you, man. I lost myself. I made mistakes, and now I'm lost. Steve embraces Clint and says, No, you're not. We have a way, a plan. We can fix all of this. We cut back to Avengers HQ as Nebula and Johnny arrive from space. Tony explains to the group how the device works, tests it out to make sure everything works properly. Clint agrees to be the one who tests out the device, and we watch as Hank enlarges a microversal entry point, and Clint successfully goes to the past, a few moments before his wife turned to dust. When he returns, we see Clint crying as he says, It worked. We then see the team formulate a plan. Hulk will travel back to the Battle of New York to get the Time Stone. Iron Man and Cap will travel to Sokovia when the Avengers fought Strucker to recover the Mind Stone. Thor, Black Widow, and Hawkeye will travel to Asgard shortly following the events of Thor Rampage of the Hulk to travel to gather the Space and Reality Stone before Heimdall could bring the Reality Stone to the Collector. And Ant-Man, Wasp, Human Torch, and Nebula will travel to space shortly before the events of Fantastic Four Negative Zone to gather both the Power Stone and the Soul Stone. As the team all suits up in their travel suits, Steve explains that this is now their opportunity to make right on what happened 3 years ago. Not only for themselves, but for the world. As they put their hands into a circle, Hank clicks a button on his wrist as the team shrinks down and time travels through the microverse. In New York, we don't see much of a change as Hulk goes to visit the Ancient One, played by Tilda Swinton, who is hesitant to give him the Time Stone until he explains that Doctor Strange is the one who said they needed to do this. The Ancient One immediately gives the stone to Banner and says, Strange is the best of us. If he is the one that said it needs to be done, it must be done. He explains that if Hulk fails to return the stones to their proper timelines once they are used, it could result in massive consequences for the timelines that the stones are being taken from. In Sokovia, Tony and Steve easily recover the Mind Stone as Strucker abandons it as he did in Age of Ultron. As they recover it, Steve looks at the documents that discuss the Winter Soldier project. Steve finally apologizes for never telling Tony about Bucky and what he did to Tony's parents. Tony apologizes for pushing Steve away at the end of Captain America Civil War. On Asgard, Thor knocks out Heimdall before he can head to the Collector and return the Reality Stone. Black Widow and Hawkeye sing to the Asgardian vault to collect the Space Stone. As Thor waits for Widow and Hawkeye, he encounters his mother, Frigga, played by Renee Russo, who talks with him. She knows that he is a time traveler because she is a witch, and Thor breaks down, telling her that he no longer feels worthy and that he has failed the universe. Frigga consoles him and tells him that as long as he is doing something about it, he is still worthy. As Black Widow and Hawkeye run towards Thor being chased by guards, Thor summons Mjolnir and realizes that he is still worthy. In space, we see that Nebula, Ant-Man, Human Torch, and Wasp arrive on Nowhere, where Nebula has successfully stolen 2 keys to 2 different ships and gives Ant-Man the location of Vormir. Hank tells Janet to go find the ship as he asks Nebula, So, Vormir, what should I expect? Janet enters the driver's quarters of the ship, and she watches out the window as Nebula is talking to Hank. Hank looks down, but up at Janet through the window, and hugs Nebula as he walks to the ship. See Hank enter the driver's room with Janet as Janet asks him if everything is okay. Hank looks at her and says, Janet, I love you. Full speed to Vormir. We watch as Johnny and Nebula arrive outside the negative zone as Johnny says, You wait right here. I'll use my powers to fly in and out of there in a jiffy. I'll get the stone in no time. I'll meet you right here. As Johnny says, Flame on, Nebula says, Wait. As Johnny looks at her, she says, You really have grown up on me, Johnny. You're no longer a kid. Johnny smiles. Well, I always think about Sue and Reed and even Ben, how they would want me to act. And I want to make them proud. I just hope that this all works out so I can see my family again. Nebula smiles as Johnny flies into the negative zone when suddenly Nebula is hit from behind and faints as we see Nebula, different than our Nebula, Ronan, played by Lee Pace, and Gamora, played by Zoe Saldana, standing and looking at her as Ronan speaks into a communicator. Father, we are returning to you early. We have made an interesting discovery. As the 3 board the sanctuary with Nebula being knocked out, We watch as minutes later, Johnny races out of the negative zone with the Annihilators chasing after him as he screams, "Okay, Nebula, we can go home now!" As he looks around, Nebula is not anywhere to be found. We cut to Titan, where we see Thanos, Ronan, Gamora, and Nebula all watching Nebula's footage from her memory bank. Thanos chuckles. "So I achieved my destiny, and these fools seek to rob me from it?" Nebula, as he turns to look at the Nebula from the current timeline. "I want you to travel back. Use whatever device these insects use to travel back here, and bring me in the Black Order there. I will not allow my destiny to be robbed." Ronan walks away and says, "I will prepare the Black Order, Father." As Thanos hands the past version of Nebula the time travel device, he walks away as Gamora stays back with our version of Nebula and asks her, "Is it really true? Does Father really kill me?" Nebula explains what happens to her in the future, and Gamora glares. "You stay here. I'm not going to allow Father to achieve his destiny. When we arrive in your time, be prepared. I'm going to free you. We will end this once and for all." As Gamora walks away, our Nebula smiles and says, "That's my sister." We cut to Hank and Janet flying towards Vormir. As Janet speaks up, "Hank, you've been awfully quiet so far. Is everything okay?" "Oh, yeah," says Hank with a bit of sadness in his voice. "I'm just thinking about the fact that we actually time traveled." Janet looks concerned. "What did you talk to Nebula about?" "Oh, just what to expect when we arrive," says Hank. "So, what are we in for? Monsters? Aliens?" asks Janet. Hank looks down. "If I told you, you wouldn't let me do what has to happen." As Janet looks confused, the two land on Vormir, and they walk off the ship and towards the Red Skull, who greets them and says, "You who seek to acquire the Soul Stone, in order to obtain its powers, you must trade a soul for a soul." Hank begins to tear up as they walk to the cliff. Janet looks at Hank and says, "Hank, what does he mean?" Hank stops and puts his hands on Janet's face softly and says, "Janet, from the moment I met you, you've been the most fascinating woman I've ever met. Your intelligence, your charm, your beauty. I know that I've not been the best husband. I put my work before you at times, even when I should have appreciated what I had right in front of me this whole time. But now I have to do something for humanity that requires me to give up what I love the most. You, Janet. I love you more than anything I've worked on. More than Ant-Man. More than..." As Hank begins to cry, he leans in and kisses Janet. As he pulls away, he says, "Everything I do, my love, I do for you." As Hank pushes Janet aside, he leaps off the cliff of Vormir. As Janet looks up and screams, we hear a thud. Janet looks down and sees Hank's lifeless body laying there as Janet is given the Soul Stone. We cut back to Avengers HQ as everyone arrives from their mission. Johnny asks Nebula, "Hey, where did you go back there?" As she walks away, "Hey, Janet?" asks Tony. "Where's Hank?" As we see a crying Janet Van Dyne holding the Soul Stone. We cut to the rest of the team finding out what happened to Hank. As Natasha begins to cry and Hulk begins consoling Thor, Johnny and Clint look downwards as Tony pats Janet on the back, and Steve walks over to Janet, holds out his hand, and says, "Jan, let's make sure Hank's sacrifice was worth it." As Janet is weeping, she takes Steve's hand as everyone walks away except Nebula, who remains at the microversal entry point. The Iron Man Infinity Gauntlet scene plays out exactly the same as it does in the MCU, with Hulk ultimately being able to make the snap. As he does, Clint receives a call from Barbara and begins to tear up. Suddenly, Avengers HQ is blasted by the Sanctuary. While the Avengers were gathering everything for the snap, Nebula successfully used a microversal entry point to allow Thanos and his army to travel to the present. Cap, Tony, and Thor all agree to confront whatever just attacked the mansion, as Wasp stays behind to help Bruce, who is still reeling from using the gauntlet. Johnny runs to find Nebula as Clint and Natasha are trapped underneath the ground with the Infinity Gauntlet. Gamora releases our Nebula from the restraints on the Sanctuary as they quietly escape the ship as we watch Thanos ascend on the Earth. We see that Clint and Natasha are stuck below the ground when we suddenly hear Outriders charging for the Infinity Gauntlet. Natasha tries to stand but is injured. Clint says, "Nat, we have to move, come on." "No," says Natasha. "I can't go on any longer. But if Thanos gets that gauntlet, it's going to be big trouble for the whole galaxy. I always said I'd fight for my family and fight to right the wrongs that happened to us 3 years ago. And, well," as she looks at Clint with a tear in her eye, "I'm going to buy you as much time as you need. Get out of here." Clint stands shocked as he watches Natasha as she screams at him, "Go, Clint, go! They're coming!" As we see Clint grab the gauntlet and run away, we watch as Black Widow is able to hold off a few of the Outriders as they eventually overpower her and kill her. Her sacrifice, however, allowed Clint to escape and keep the Infinity Gauntlet out of the hands of Thanos. Johnny faces off against the variant of Nebula from the past when our Nebula shoots her, killing her as Gamora watches. Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor face off against Thanos, and the fight plays out almost exactly the same way as it does in the MCU's Endgame. Captain America is able to wield Mjolnir, but his shield is destroyed by Thanos' blade. As Captain America looks on, we see the Black Order, Variant Ronin, Outriders, and Kree all facing down Captain America. Cap grips his broken shield and is ready to fight when suddenly we hear a familiar voice say, "Don't worry, Cap. I'm keeping my promise. We are with you till the end of the line." As we watch as portals open, revealing Black Panther, played by Michael B. Jordan, Bucky Barnes, played by Sebastian Stan, War Machine, played by Don Cheadle, Namor, played by Raul Castillo, Nova, played by Glenn Powell, Drax, played by Dave Bautista, Mr. Fantastic, played by Keanu Reeves, Invisible Woman, played by Amanda Peet, Thing, voiced by Jason Sudeikis, Doctor Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, Spider-Man, played by Tom Holland, Princess Shuri, played by Latita Wright, M'Baku, played by Winston Duke, Okoye, Wong, played by Benedict Wong, Valkyrie, Korg, Pepper Potts in her rescue armor, the Tribes of Wakanda, Atlanteans, Sorcerers of Kamar-Taj, and the Asgardians all walk out of the portals. Wasp grows large and drops Hulk, Human Torch, Nebula, and Gamora on the battlefield as Captain America shouts, "Avengers! Assemble!" We cut between various heroes fighting the forces of the Black Order as Clint attempts to get the Infinity Gauntlet away from them. Spider-Man reunites with Iron Man, and as Parker starts explaining everything that happened back on Titan, Iron Man embraces him. Iron Man then goes to Doctor Strange, who says, "You said you saw so many outcomes of how this battle would go. Is this the one where we win?" Doctor Strange looks concerned. "Yes, but if I told you how it ends, it's not going to happen." We see the battle continue on, and Thanos starts to lose, as well as the members of the Black Order. Thanos then orders that the Sanctuary fire on the battlefield, and as it does, Captain Marvel flies down and destroys the ship. We see the Infinity Gauntlet get passed around the battlefield, with Thanos ultimately gaining control of it. Unlike in the actual MCU Endgame, there is no truck that they are trying to get to return to the past, so they're literally playing a game of keep away from Thanos. Captain Marvel fights Thanos, but she is overpowered when Thanos grabs the Power Stone and punches her with it. Doctor Strange motions to Iron Man. As we see Thanos put the gauntlet back on, Iron Man grabs the gauntlet but is easily punched away by Thanos. Thanos chuckles and says, "I am inevitable." He snaps his fingers, but nothing happens. We see Iron Man with the Infinity Stones forming the gauntlet on his hands, and he looks at the camera and he says the words, "Oh yeah? Well, I am Iron Man," and snaps his fingers. We watch as Thanos, the Black Order, and the remainder of his minions begin fading away. Watch as Tony Stark lays burnt. The use of the Infinity Stones was too much for him to handle. War Machine, Spider-Man, and Pepper come to check on him as we see his chest piece burn out as we watch as Earth's first hero, Iron Man, Tony Stark, is dead. While everyone is distracted with the death of Tony Stark, Gamora leaves the battlefield. The movie ends with a compilation of funerals. First one is for Hank Pym, and we watch Janet weeping with the other Avengers. We also have a funeral for Natasha, and finally, a funeral for Tony Stark, where we see proof Tony Stark has a heart being used to represent the fallen hero. Now, instead of going into a long monologue about what happens at the end of the film, I'm going to quickly break down all the main characters who remain and tell you what happens to them. Captain America stays in the present and does not time travel back to the past. He agrees that while there might not be an Avengers team for now, he will step up and lead when and if the time comes. For now, he wants to spend time with Bucky Barnes. Thor appoints Valkyrie, the leader of the Asgardians, and explains that if one thing has been made clear, the galaxy needs heroes who will stand up to danger when it shows its face. Thor joins Nova, Drax, and Nebula as they head back to Nidavellir to recover the Nova 2 and begin their adventures as the new team dubbed the Asgardians of the Galaxy. Wasp says she will return to Pym Technologies eventually, but she'll need to figure out what's going to happen next. Hawkeye says that he's going back to California to spend time with his wife, but he will be on standby if Cap needs him for anything. We also see that Hawkeye hung on to Black Widow's Widow Bite gauntlets. Black Panther says that he will take Cap's shield to Wakanda so he can repair it, and also says that he'll be on standby if Cap needs him. Spider-Man is reeling from the loss of Iron Man, and this will be explored further in future projects. Reed agrees that the Fantastic Four will lay low for a bit, and they all have some catching up to do. Ben notes that he's finally going to get on the dating market. Wong makes Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme again, and he says he will keep watch of the Sanctums, but will also be ready if something happens and will be ready to assist Captain America. Captain Marvel says she will be back more often, but she has heard the Skrulls might have become fractured in the time of the snap, so she needs to head back and investigate. War Machine says that he will try his best to continue the legacy of his friend, Tony Stark. And Hulk says that once he has returned the stones to the various timelines, he will be spending time with Dr. Cho to repair his arm and Doc Samson to continue his therapy. We watch as Cap places Mjolnir on a newly constructed microversal entry point built by Banner and Van Dyne. As the credits roll, we watch Hulk return to the various timelines and return the Infinity Stones and Mjolnir. That is the 12th project of Rebooted MCU Phase 3 Avengers Endgame. Now I know that some of you guys might be a little bummed that Iron Man, Black Widow, and Ant-Man are no longer around in my Rebooted MCU. I wanted to go ahead and just say that I feel like one of the bigger problems in our current MCU is that the writers and the directors, I feel like, don't sometimes know exactly when a character has sort of run their course. And what I mean by that is that in my Rebooted MCU, I'm never going to keep a character around longer than they have to. So once a character has completed their story arc, and I feel like they have told every single part of the story, at least that I want to tell, I'm not going to keep them around just because they are a great fan favorite character. I want them to serve a purpose. I want them to have a meaningful role in the story. And I think that this ending hopefully puts a perfect cap on Iron Man, Black Widow, and Ant-Man in the MCU in my rebooted version. So I want to thank you all for watching. I'm going to end it here. There's still one more episode left in Rebooted MCU Phase 3, and it should be coming out really soon. So make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all then. Take care.